dangerous. My brother was dating a white girl and nobody wanted to tell me. That's how bad I was. Nobody wanted to tell me. They would not tell me that he was dating a white girl. And I was just insane. I was mentally ill with rage.
And I grew up in that era. I went to segregated schools in Chicago, and so I remember it vividly, as any black who grew up in that time does. And when we were in that time, we had no moral authority. We were in fact second class, and I couldn't get jobs. I couldn't walk in neighborhoods. I couldn't be a paper boy in a white neighborhood. They didn't want a black kid riding his bike at 6 in the morning through their neighborhood.
Martin wanted some shoes, and they were real cute. And they went to the store, but in the South in those days, if you were black, you had to go into the back. You couldn't try on the shoes. And so the man says to my grandfather, "You need to get up and leave. Who do you think you are? You're gonna try on shoes in this store?" And he called him a name. So Daddy King pretty much said, "Keep your money, let's go." And so Martin was pretty much like, "Well, Dad, why didn't we just get the shoes?" And he says, we're men, and we stand up, and nobody makes us, we're not to be made to feel less.
Had just come out of a brutal chattel slavery and were considered less than human, considered property, and so they were angry and they wanted to see the cause of civil rights move along a lot more rapidly. Booker T. Washington, on the other hand, because he lived in the South, most of the critics didn't live in the South. They were in the North, they were freedmen, so they were not directly affected by what was happening in the South. Because Booker T. Washington lived there, he absolutely was a slave. He was affected by what was going on in the South, and so he intimately was involved and knew what would happen if he agitated more immediately for civil and political rights. So instead, he realized that if he could get the masses educated, he knew that that was going to help them to build a strong economic foundation, a strong economic base, which in his opinion would in turn almost command the political and civil rights. W.E.B. Du Bois, on the other hand, of course, believed that that should be immediate. He thought that it should take I guess their differences were a difference of priorities. He felt that the priority should be agitating for civil and political rights. So even then there were those that maligned Booker T. Washington, but much less so than a generation that came along after the victories of the civil rights movement. They came along, as I said, after Dr. Martin Luther King. They were a much more militant generation. They didn't even understand Booker T. Washington, or probably never read much of what he read, but they knew he represented, at least in their mind, a more accommodationist personality, and they were hostile to that. They absolutely believed that you had to be in the face of people that they believed were denying them their civil rights.
We weren't protesting to make white folks like us. We weren't protesting to be accepted by white people. I don't want to be a credit to my race. I don't care if I'm a credit to my race or not. I want the right to compete against you. So the lunch counter sitting in Greensboro wasn't to get a sandwich. It wasn't to try to make sure that you serve me properly. It was the right for me to open up a restaurant right next door.
My life has been the civil rights movement here in America. I joined the movement in the early 60s, formally, the Harlem chapter of CORE. Succeeded with some violence, but a minimum of violence. In the case of CORE and the NAACP, we lost members. The NAACP lost Medgar Evers and other workers. We in CORE lost 3 young men, Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney, who were murdered in Mississippi.
They felt that their job was to do the following: get in front of the cameras and let the dogs get turned on them, let the water hose get turned on them. They knew they had to do it. Let them be seen going off to jail. And they believed that the conscience of America would be pricked by the Holy Spirit if they were vulnerable enough to let these atrocities be seen publicly.
Daddy King was against almost every one of King's actions that risked going to jail. He hated it. He did think his son was going to get killed. His son was killed.
And the year after Dr. King was assassinated, my dad was killed. He was found in a swimming pool with no water in his lungs, and his head was bruised. And Daddy was, there had been many attempts on his life as well.
In my childhood, I can recall reading about blacks being lynched. Even in the face of all of these economic and social injustices, the black community stayed together, that we didn't have this black-on-black crime. We didn't have this proliferation of out-of-wedlock births because of the moral, guide-centered values that defined us and kept the moral glue that kept us together.
The civil rights movement, my parents met and married in the civil rights movement. So I saw all of that unfold as a child, was a part of it, certainly was on the liberal side of the political spectrum. But as time went on, it became clear to me that liberalism was more of a problem, and that there was some fundamentally really bad ideas that kept coming into play.
You had two civil rights movements. The civil rights movement of the rank and file, which was not radical, and the civil rights movement of the leadership establishment. The gurus, the strategists behind the scene, they were very left-wing. Many of them were ex-commies, fellow travelers. But I don't want to besmirch that great record of the civil rights movement. It accomplished some great things.
The main accomplishment of the civil rights movement was to finally give legal backing to laws that existed 100 years before the civil rights movement. But as the reality of a newly empowered political body became apparent, the old oppressors had to remake their image to appeal to their new potential voters. The Democrats mischaracterized a political move by the Republican Party to court Southern Democrats in a plan called the Southern Strategy. The immediate spin of the Southern Strategy was that Nixon tried to appeal to racist Democrats in the South by using the code phrase states' rights, harking back to the days of Southern secession when slaveholding states left the Union, citing that as their reason. It is overlooked, though, that many Southern Democrats joined the Republican Party because of their history of civil rights, not in spite of it. How many were ashamed to be associated with a party that would shut down public schools instead of letting children attend just because of the color of their skin? It was not Republican governors standing in schoolhouse doors. They were all Democrats.
The governor is adamant. He made a campaign promise to stand in the doorway himself to prevent the integration of the last all-white state university.
Democratic Governor Faubus, unable to prevent black students from attending school because of the federal protection they had received, simply shut down the schools for the next year to prevent further attendance. And Virginia Democratic Governor James Almond, like other Southern Democratic governors, also shut down public schools rather than permit black students to attend. In 1960 in Louisiana, where Democratic Governor Jimmy Davis supported segregation, it required 4 federal marshals to accompany little Ruby Bridges so she could attend a public elementary school in New Orleans.
But the architect of the Southern Strategy, Pat Buchanan, wrote a column for Richard Nixon in 1966 that declared we would build our Republican Party on a foundation of states' rights, human rights, small government, and a strong national defense, and leave it to the party of Maddox, Mahoney, and Wallace to squeeze the last ounces of political juice out of the rotting fruit of racial injustice. In that one sentence, it was clear that his meaning of states' rights had nothing to do with race, but with a more constructionist interpretation of the Constitution.
A lot of controversy surrounds the Southern Strategy, but we hear nothing about the Southern Redemption, which was planned and created in the late 1800s to overturn all civil rights gained after the Civil War.
Or the Southern Manifesto, which was the Democrats' response to the Supreme Court ruling in Brown versus Board of Education.
After 100 years of civil rights legislation sponsored by Republicans and fought by Democrats, it is still speculation as to why the vast majority of Black Americans support the very party that has historically opposed civil rights for them.
Something also happened that also really brought about blacks not just thinking about the Democratic Party, but actually becoming part of the Democratic Party. And that was when Barry Goldwater became the stand-up bearer of the Republican Party. So here comes Barry Goldwater from Arizona, and one of the things that he pledged, that if he became the stand-up bearer of the Republican Party, that he would not support civil rights. He would turn his back on civil rights. That message was so potent in the black community, that started the exodus of blacks from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party. But that wasn't it. Even then, Martin Luther King's father, Daddy King, was a Republican, was still very supportive of the Republican Party.
So then we were very anxious in the campaign to bring Kennedy and King together. And we had set up a meeting for them to meet, and King was going to be very affirmative toward him, but not directly support him. King got arrested in Atlanta. That meeting never took place. We immediately, in the civil rights section, prepared a statement by Kennedy opposing his arrest and calling for his release. Coretta was 6 months pregnant, and she called me in panic when she heard in the middle of the night he had been driven to the state penitentiary 100 or so miles from Atlanta. And so afterwards, this colleague, Louis Martin, and I were saying, what can we do? Because Kennedy had said, no, I can't issue your statement because I've talked to the governor. And the governor of Georgia says he will get him out of jail if I don't issue a public statement. And Kennedy said, that's what we're interested in most, isn't it? And I said, of course. And so he couldn't issue a public statement. And I got the idea that, well, wait, maybe one thing he could do is just call Mrs. King and say, we're working on it, and you know, you have our sympathy and our support, but not issue a public statement. And I told Sergeant Shriver that we had this great idea of something that he could do that would show his compassion and his support. And Shriver said, well, it's not too late, it's a great idea. He said, you know, you were stymied in what we can do about this because of your agreement with the governor. But Mrs. King is distraught, and what would you think of telephoning her? And Sarge says, Kennedy gave this big grin and said, that's a wonderful idea. Do you have her number? He had her number, and he dialed it, and he talked to her. And so then Bobby, when he learned, was absolutely appalled. He said, you probably lost the election. 3 Southern governors had said if we publicly support Martin Luther King, they'll throw their states to Nixon, and you're finished. No more editorializing or anything. And it was those 2 actions, the call that led to Daddy King saying, if he had the courage to wipe the tears from my daughter-in-law's eyes, I have the courage to support a Catholic for president. He had been on a full-page ad supporting Nixon because America could not risk having the Pope run the country. But he said, I've got a suitcase full of votes, and I'm taking them up to Senator Kennedy. And we then produced a pamphlet. Nixon had said no comment on the whole thing. And we produced a pamphlet that said, no comment, the case of Martin Luther King, no comment Nixon versus a candidate with a heart. And we got black churches distributed about 2 million copies of that. It was called the Blue Bomb. And Teddy White and others believe they can show in a number of states the surge of black votes beyond anything Stevenson had got made the difference, and enough votes to make the difference. Remembering that Kennedy winning by 100,000 votes leaves it to anyone who influenced 100,000 votes to feel they had a part in his victory. That it's
as timely as it was, can one phone call really overturn 150 years of segregation? Can one phone call erase Jim Crow laws, literacy tests, and poll taxes? And can one phone call wipe out years of institutionalized discrimination? That was a time when black Americans truly were disenfranchised and prevented from voting. But liberal black leaders today try and use that as an excuse when their party doesn't win an election.